All right, guys, welcome back to Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick will be discussing Colorado football and how good the Buffaloes can potentially be in 2025. A variety of different topics on screen. We're going to go ahead and get into one that I think is going to potentially be overlooked as, the defense improved greatly last year. Can they stay consistent despite these departures? And they have a lot of monumental departures, Nick. Of course, the Heisman winner, Travis Hunter, is going to be the headliner. But it's not just him. You have guys up front like B.J. Green, Chidozie Nwankwo, who were superstars from Colorado. These were big-time portal additions that helped lead Colorado in conference in terms of tackles for loss and sacks. There were 6 in the conference in scoring defense. They showed the ability to be more of a complete team, which is very encouraging because in Deion's first year, this defense was abysmal. They were a major liability, of course. The amount of space opponents were able to generate against them was just mind-blowing. And this past year, you're really seeing that get shored up, especially on the ground against the run. And you've seen better playmaking across the board from the front 7. But now the focus is going to be on this coaching staff, Nick, because the 2 guys that did the heavy lifting were transfers that were good throughout their entire college career. So I don't think you can just, peg that on the coaching staff doing a great job. It's more so veteran players coming in and leaving an impact. And the portal work was not as prolific on the defensive line this season. So now more of it's going to be on the coaching staff. We'll talk about some of the guys they return because I do think they have good depth and potential to be good. But the heavy lifters are gone, Nick, so the coaching staff's really going to have to amp up their production.
The coaching staff certainly has their work cut out for them this upcoming season. When you look at Colorado, comparing 2023 to 2024, this defense was just leaps and bounds better. It gave up 75 yards less per game passing, while also giving up about 25 yards less per game on the ground. So they were really strong. They also cut down. They gave up about 2 rushing touchdowns per game in 2023. They gave up 1.3 in 2024. So they improved mightily against the run. They were only giving up about 3.9 yards per carry this past season. 2 years ago, it was 4.7. So they were seeing huge improvements year to year, and a lot of that was because they added great players out of the portal like Green and Nwankwo, while also Shane Cokes was involved in the defensive line and the pressure there. So this is a unit that was really solid here. They've added some interesting names, right? I think there's some guys we're talking about here that are really worth highlighting. Of course, Travis Hunter just was phenomenal this past season for them in the secondary, while Shiloh Sanders was really good as well. Levante Bentley will be gone as well at linebacker. So they're losing a ton of talent across the board on the defensive side of the ball. They brought in some players out of the portal, but they have not really done as much as you would hoped. About 6 guys they brought in on the defensive, 5-6 guys they brought in on the defensive side of the ball that could be key difference makers, but they have a lot of work to do. This defense, the improvements were massive for this team. I think that went a long way in why this team ended up, winning 9 games this past season compared to really not having a strong season in Deion's first season. The points per game was down for the defense, certainly, which was really solid for them. They were able to play a lot better defense, giving up 300 points against total, about 23 points per game for their opponents this past season, which I think is a number that is really solid considering they were at 34.5 the year prior. They put together a really strong effort on the defensive line, but they have to find a way to keep that continuity. If this defensive line struggles, teams will run all over them again, and it can really pose threats for Deion in year 3.
The defensive line, on the interior is looking solid. To return Anquin Barnes, Theron Carter, 2 guys that should have better impacts this season. Maury McNeil was solid. Tariq Thomas, a 300-pounder. He wasn't all that good, but he's going to have to step up for them. They added Jaheim Oates. He's down to 325 pounds. Never really did much for the Tide as time went on, like we kind of envisioned he would. Also picked up Tavion Coleman. He was a great run defender for Texas State. Little undersized, though, 6'1", 295. And alongside them coming off the edge, you have Arden Walker, 4.5 sacks, Samuel Okunlola, 7 TFL, in rotational type appearances. So I think those guys are going to be, nice focal points for them as starting edge defenders. Tajay McCoy and Keaton Wade were pretty good in their limited appearance as well. So I think edge department's in pretty good standing. No ads in the portal in that category. And I think that the interior is also looking pretty solid, Nick. Again, they're losing Green and Nwankwo is going to be tough for them to dance around. So it's going to have to be, much like it was last year, though, a collective, group effort to be strong in those respective categories. And I think Colorado's certainly built to do that once again.
Yeah, I like some of the players they have here right off there. I think Walker's really solid. He can certainly step up. I think Barnes and McNeil are solid depth. I think the 2 guys out of the portal. I think Coleman's certainly the player that you have the higher expectations for right now. About 5.5 tackles for loss last year, 26 total tackles, 2.5 sacks. Similar numbers the year before that. So, solid 4 QB hurries last year as well for Texas State. So he's a guy that's got some good experience, bounced around a little bit, was at Utah State prior. He's a solid athlete that they plug in here. Jaheim Oates, you wanted more out of him at Alabama. You were hoping he was going to produce a little bit more. just never really worked out for him in Tuscaloosa. Had a bad year last year. Didn't really put any notes. In 2023, he did have 26 total tackles. Just nothing really from him last year. Only played in 2 games at the start of the season. He's a guy that, maybe he could potentially get the best out of him. Definitely was disappointing his time in Tuscaloosa, but still an athlete that can certainly be involved in the defensive line. Tajay McCoy is a player that I'm really excited on coming off the edge there. Keaton Wade as well could certainly be involved off that right side. Potential to see him develop and turn into a strong athlete for this team, a guy that's been in the program for a little bit now, a previous transfer himself. This defensive line has to be good, right? They got to get QB hurries. They have to put pressure on the quarterback, stuff the run as well. The interior looks strong with 2 new guys plugging in, replacing some of the departing players, and the edge unit returning 2 players from last year, hoping to grow their game. Could be promising for this defensive line.
Look at the middle of this defense. The linebacking group was vastly improved. They were much better in terms of positioning versus the run, a lot better technique, and overall playmaking was improved. They lose the top 3 guys, though, had the most snaps in the box. Both linebackers, Levante Bentley and Nakia Hill-Green, and, of course, Selman Craig in the secondary. He played a lot in the box, so it's going to be a complete makeover here. Reginald Hughes, he was a great player for Jackson State this past season. He's expected to be the alpha dog. You also have Martavius French. He was a good player for UTSA over the last 3 years. This past season, 80 tackles, 17 tackles for loss. He was a dominant playmaker for them, so they're certainly hoping that production will carry over to Boulder. Then you have Jeremiah Brown. He followed Dion over from Jackson State. The only time he saw significant action, though, was in 2022. We played a versatile role. He was pretty good in doing so, coming off the edge a lot. He was a good pass rusher where he had 7 sacks. Not exactly sure why he hasn't played much since then, but if they can get him back to going at that type of role here at the FBS level, that'd be phenomenal for this defense to have that type of rover player in their front 7. What do you make of the linebacking group, Nick? Because they have yet to have anybody in-house really step up. This is not a position they've really seemed to recruit at all. It's a lot of veterans, a lot of transfers from other schools. It's not exactly a bad thing. I think we're trying to build continuity in your program, and it's eventually going to catch up to them. But for this upcoming season, the 2 guys they added, I think, will do as well as the ones they had last year.
This is a unit that could have some room to grow, certainly. I think some of the ads are interesting. Hughes was a really interesting add at Jackson State. Guy previously was at Ole Miss, didn't really work out for him there, but he's a solid athlete. 82 total tackles, 9.5 tackles lost, 4.5 sacks, 6 QB hurries. I think those are solid numbers for this guy, 6'2", 230. He's got some good speed, had a solid enough season this past year, can be involved for this team. I think, he's really good at Jacksonville State for the Gamecocks. Had some good appearances against Western Kentucky in the regular season finale, had 9 total tackles in that one. That was a pretty strong performance. Had 13 total tackles against a weaker opponent early in the year, so he's a guy that could be involved in this linebacking unit that could be a solid piece. French, obviously, you're getting a lot of production out of him coming over from UTSA, 80 total tackles and the 17 tackles for loss, 4 QB hurries and 3 pass breakups. Good numbers there. Had 4 QB hurries in 2023 as well. A guy that was able to put some solid numbers on the board. Had 2 tackles for loss and 10 total tackle performance against Memphis. A guy that's all over the place at linebacker. Really solid player. They added Kalen Salter from TCU, who didn't really play last year as a true freshman, but a guy that's a high upside player coming in from adding from TCU as well. They have Brown, who's been with the program for a little bit, got some reps, got some experience, and hoping to continue to develop his game. This is a linebacking core that they got a lot of players to replace, but I think these guys they added could be really solid for this defense.
Now we'll quickly touch on the secondary in Deion's first year. They were abysmal. This past year, though, they didn't allow a single game of 300-plus yards, and on a per-game basis, they averaged 200 per contest allowed. So it was a great unit overall. Hunter, of course, departs, taking home a lot of hardware. DJ McKinney, he's going to move into that CB1 role. He's going to be an alpha. He was really good for them last year. He's been good at Oklahoma State. I think he's going to handle that role with grace. He'll be a great CB1. Colton Hood's likely to be the other corner. Pretty horrid as a tackler, but he was solid in coverage. I think with more experience, he'll certainly get better. Ivan Yates and R.J. Johnson barely played last year. They're going to be depth. Preston Hodge, he was a great transfer from Liberty. He was very good for the Flames. He was abused in coverage in the slot last year periodically, so he's certainly going to have to look to improve or potentially losing his job. Carter Stroudmeyer wasn't that bad, but when you look at the safety group, someone's going to have to step up and replace Shiloh Sanders' ability when it comes to those run fits and physicality. And I think that's where the transfer to Tariq Byard is so critical. He was really good in that regard for USF for a couple of seasons, or I think really just one season this past year. Byard was a phenomenal player in that role. So I think that's a great find from Deion Sanders and the staff to find a guy they can, plug into the lineup to replace someone that has that similar skill set. So the secondary, Nick, I think they'll be good, but losing Hunter, it's obviously really hard to gauge how great they can be.
It's certainly difficult to replace the type of talent that he leaves with. I think Byard was a solid add from South Florida. 6'1", 200 pounds. Had some reps here and there last year for South Florida. Was really good towards the latter half of the season. 54 total tackles, 8 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, and a pick for him. Definitely improved his game as the season went on. I think he had some solid numbers here. Actually had a decent showing against Alabama earlier in the year as well, but had a good game against Charlotte with 11 total tackles, including a sack. In that one, had the pick against Tulsa and 5 total tackles. So a player that I think can develop his craft. I think he's a solid add at the end of the day for this defense that really needed another player. Makari Vickers from Oklahoma did not play for the Sooners, but a guy that still has a lot of high upside potentially. He could be involved in this defense in this as a safety position. A solid player. I think DJ McKinney's a really good player. Hoping to see what he looks like. Colton Hood had a solid season last year at times. Preston Hodge has to improve his coverage, but a really good tackler nonetheless. That could be involved in the secondary. They might play him at nickel. A solid player overall, and Stoudemire has to be good as well. Battling with the 2 transfers for playing time. The secondary will certainly not be as good as it was last year, but I don't think the fall off will be too severe. This unit has to be strong, though, because the secondary was weak in 2023, and that really did a big number on that defense. Have to have a better year than they did in 2023, but maybe not as good as a year in 2024. Just a middle of the road somewhere between the 2 previous seasons.
Now let's go ahead and move to the offensive side of the ball, and the biggest topic here is not just Shedeur Sanders departing, but I think the offensive line, because regardless of who's at QB, we want to know if these big bodies up front can start to offer something for this football team. Jordan Seaton, left tackle, figures that he's going to continue to evolve as one of the top left tackles in CFB as a former #1 recruit. They did add 2 starters to the interior. Good experience across them both, and Zy Chrysler from Illinois. He was a 3-year starter. Was never really all that great for them, but he was, he's an experienced right guard from the Big Ten. Also picked up a center in Zarian McGill, a 308-pounder from LA Tech, who was good this past season. Cash Cleveland, though, at center was really good for them the final few weeks of this season. So this is very encouraging stuff, Nick. We finally have some really good, respectable competition as some of these positional groups. Tyler Brown returns. He was respectable last season, only 1 sack allowed. He and Kareem Harden weren't all that bad. They're both going to compete for playing time. Maybe both of them end up starting. Phillip Houston wasn't very good at right tackle. He's only a 250-pounder, too, based on last year's chart, and I would imagine he's going to continue that on size. They added Ike Ogabayi from Texas A&M. He was not that good over 5 years, didn't play much, so I don't know if he's really going to provide much here at all. They got 2 incoming 4-stars as well, in Cardi Smith and Chauncey Godin. So they seem to have a much better, deeper, more cohesive unit up front, Nick. This is some encouraging stuff overall. But for the most part, it is a lot of the same bodies from last year with a couple of transfers, none of them that figure to be high-impact transfers. But I think collectively this will be a better group. Over the last 2 years, the O-line's been abysmal, amongst the worst in college football. And Shedeur Sanders was still tearing up opponents, boosting his draft stock into a top 5 selection. So what can this team accomplish with a great offensive line? I'd love to find out.
I'd love to find out as well. I think Jordan Seaton, we saw promise out of the highly rated freshman last year. We'll get some more reps under his belt. We'll continue to develop as a pass blocker and run blocker at left tackle. A really solid player. I think Cash Cleveland could certainly be a good center there. Zarian McGill will fight with him certainly, and then Zay Chrysler, I think, was a really solid add from Illinois. He could be involved in this offensive line at left guard. I think he'll be a really good leader for them. Tyler Brown, Houston Phillip, 2 guys on the right side that I think will return and be really solid for this offensive line. This unit, was still not very good last year. They were better, but not good enough at all. They have to find a way to continue to develop and build in the trench. I think Dion's starting to learn that he has to build a offensive line and defensive line that are both really strong and dominant, particularly the offensive line as well. He's got to find a way to work on that and see what he can do with it here. I think these ads are not bad at all. I think Chrysler is certainly a solid ad. I think Seaton will continue to develop and turn into the prospect that we thought he was going to. As long as his development does not get stunted, I think that left side will be just fine this year.
And now that kind of leads you to who will be starting at quarterback. I think it's a pretty easy discussion to have. Caden Salter, a numerous year starter at Liberty who's had a lot of success, coming off a bit of a disappointing season as a passer. The production wasn't all that great. In his final game against Sam Houston State, he looked awful, completed 34%, had 2 picks. But the talent was incredibly scarce at Liberty this past year at pass catcher. And I think one thing that's very beneficial with this addition at quarterback is they have a guy who's a dual threat who can make things happen with his legs. This offensive line's weaknesses can be offset a good bit now, Nick, with designed quarterback runs and a guy who can improvise. Of course, Shedeur did that very well, right? But, it was for him to look to make plays downfield with his arm, not so much Salter, who can burn a defense with his legs if they lose their containment. So I think that's also another exciting aspect of this roster is Caden Salter is a perfect fit here from Colorado. Of course, you're going to battle with Julian Lewis, a highly ranked recruit. coming out of high school as a true freshman. I know they did a lot to get him here. They sold a nice package to Lewis, who will eventually get on the field in some capacity. I don't know if he'll be in 2025, Nick, and the better off Colorado will be is with Lewis being on the sideline, because that means Salter is really making things work for him. I'm very excited to see how this plays out, though.
Yeah, I think Salter's a no-brainer to start. I mean, yes, he had a down season, certainly, but I think it makes too much sense to play him. This is a guy that's been around the sport for a while, a veteran player who's really got a lot of potential. In 2023, he had 2,800 yards passing, 32 touchdowns, 6 picks, in addition to 1,000 yards on the ground and 12 scores this past season. The numbers were certainly less, right? 1,800 yards passing, 15 touchdowns to 6 picks, and then 587 and 7 scores on the ground. But still a dynamic guy that can really do a lot for your offense. 6'1", 200 pounds, has a really solid frame, played good football at Liberty over the past 2 seasons. So I think, yes, it was a bit disappointing this past year, certainly, but still a player that's super talented and you could really do a lot with. I never really advocate the starting true freshman quarterbacks unless the situation is kind of one of those where it has to happen, kind of like last year with Dylan Raiola and Nebraska. That's one of those situations where I felt like it kind of had to happen. I think Michigan's in a similar boat this season, but most situations, I think you got to rest your quarterback, let your young quarterback learn college, kind of figure out what's going on here. Of course, Lewis has all the tools to be one of the best quarterbacks in college football. There's a reason why they paid him all that money. He got all the accolades in high school, was a key player, getting tons of recruiting looks from a lot of different schools, 6'1", 185, played in Georgia, high-level football in Georgia, highly rated 4-star, 5-star, depending on where you look. He's going to be really good for this team when he does get the start, but I think Salter's the no-brainer right now. I think Keaton Salter makes a ton of sense for this team. I think he can really do a lot in this offense, like you said there. Design runs, quarterback misdirection, keep the defense on their toes. He's a guy that's a complete athlete. If he's fully focused, keeps his head on straight, I think he's going to have a phenomenal season for Colorado this year.
Yeah, I certainly want to ask you, Nick, to cap things off, how good can this team be, and what will the effect be with the departure of Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders? These two are both going to go top 5 in the draft, and there was at times where you watched this team and you went, they would be really bad if they didn't have these 2 players on this roster. I mean, that's how it seemed at times. Last year they seemed to be a much more competent football team across the board. They beat some really respectable opponents, and they were in consideration there at the end, Nick, to be able to make the college football playoff. If they could have beat Kansas, they would have went to Arlington and they would have had a shot. So this is a team that did accomplish a lot. But over the last 2 years, that sentiment seemed to be very real. If they didn't have these 2 players, where would they be? And that's what we're going to find out moving forward. I think that's where the pressure is now going to be on for Deion and the staff to create this cohesive unit across the board. It's not going to be elite players every single year like they just had. So interesting prospect when you're looking at it from that side of things, Nick. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think this team could be an 8-win team this year. The schedule is not like super hard, but it's also not particularly easy. They open the year hosting Georgia Tech on a Friday night at the end of August. The Yellow Jackets, that's a team that's very solid. And last year, North Dakota State gave them a scare on a weeknight primetime game. So that's a game you want to keep an eye on. Certainly, a lot of people watch that game Friday night on August 29th. That Georgia Tech team, that's a solid team, right? That team can certainly make some noise even on the road. The rest of the non-conference, Delaware, Wyoming, I'm not really too concerned about that on the offset. But then you play your conference schedule. Got to play BYU and Iowa State, 2 ranked teams at home, as well as Arizona State, a 3rd ranked team, plus a trip to Kansas State at the end of the season. So that's 4 ranked teams there on the schedule. A bit of an interesting stretch in the middle of their 2 byes as well, at Utah, hosting Arizona, at West Virginia. Teams that could potentially be solid this year. What is BYU going to look like? What is Iowa State going to look like? Is Arizona State going to be able to keep up that same sort of momentum? So some tough games on the schedule here, but I think this team can certainly win 8 games right now with the way that things are kind of shaking out. Maybe push that 9-win mark. I don't think this team will compete to win the Big 12. I don't think they're going to be competing for a college football playoff spot, but the schedule is not ridiculously tough. Definitely not a pushover either. Some interesting matchups. They do benefit by playing some of their tougher games, really 4 of their 5 toughest games at home, which is certainly a benefit because that home crowd does show up now. They do have great energy up there in Boulder. That's really impressive to see. Have that tough game to end the season on the road at Kansas State. Certainly we'll keep an eye on that one. But I think the team still has a really solid projection going forward. I think Deion's putting together a solid enough roster. It certainly will be a dip because you're losing some star power, 2 top 5 picks, and a guy who won the Heisman Trophy for crying out loud, playing 2 positions, defensive and offensive, and having a phenomenal season on both. So expect a step backwards, but I don't think it's going to be a drastic step that some people are maybe hoping for.
Yeah, it'll be very fun to watch this team overcome some of those hurdles. I certainly think they're well equipped, though, with some of the guys they picked up, and of course some of the returnees they have. So this will be a fun team to watch this year. Nick, as always, appreciate joining me. It'll be fun to break this team down again in a couple of months when we do our full prediction. I imagine it'll be pretty favorable for the Buffaloes.
certainly will be pretty favorable. And like I said, looking forward to that opening night game on Friday the 29th. Getting that weeknight slot there on opening weekend. Always good to see this team in national primetime, assuming ESPN, ABC will be broadcasting the game on primetime, maybe Fox. It's going to be really fun to watch. I'm excited to see what this Colorado team can do in Deion Sanders' year 3.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.